Hello, my name's Dr. Connor Long and I'm back with a vivarium build for my mourning gecko colony. This is the first vivarium that I've built completely from scratch, and I decided to start with my mourning geckos because it allows me to make an enclosure that's a little bit smaller. Eventually I hope to build new enclosures for my leopard gecko, my ball python, and eventually a very large enclosure for my chameleon. If you've been enjoying my videos, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps me grow the channel and also lets me know that there are people who find these videos useful and that I should continue to make them. Mourning geckos are a small, primarily nocturnal gecko species that are easy to keep in captivity. They're an all-female parthogenic species, which means that females lay fertile eggs without breeding with a male. This means that without proper planning, you may be overrun by mourning geckos, although they also reportedly will eat their own babies and sometimes their own eggs. All of my mourning geckos are from a single female of supposedly Hawaiian origin, though I have no way to verify that. I currently have 5 adults and a number of eggs that will presumably be hatching in the near future. I've previously kept them with my dart frogs in a very large vivarium and by themselves in smaller enclosures, but I wanted to move the colony to its own designated habitat. This enclosure is 19.5 inches long, 18 inches tall, and 12 inches deep, which is equivalent to about 18 gallons. In terms of enclosure size, I'm not intending to let this colony grow much larger than 5 individuals, so this enclosure should be more than large enough for my geckos. The late Sean McKeown, who was the herpetology curator at the Honolulu Zoo, where these animals also occur naturally in the wild, wrote that you can keep about 4 geckos per 5 gallons if each gecko has its own hiding place. Theoretically, this enclosure is large enough for about 14 geckos by that metric. I personally think that would be pushing it. Other recommendations I've seen from Reptiles magazine, also I think Reptiles has a care guide on these guys, and those recommend about twice as much space per gecko. I'd be comfortable with maybe 6 or 7 geckos in here permanently, and I will be planning it very densely to provide a variety of hiding spots. Since this was my first woodworking project ever, I did not record a step-by-step tutorial of the construction process. I didn't do this because I had no previous experience using a table saw, and I wanted to focus on keeping my fingers attached to my body. I also figured that I could make a better tutorial in the future once I knew what I was doing, if it looked like people were interested. This project ultimately turned out well, but I made a lot of novice mistakes along the way that would have been unsuitable for a tutorial anyway. Still, I'll show some highlights of me putting it together. I used redwood for the frame and 1/4 inch plywood for the walls to make the enclosure as light as possible and keep lumber costs to a minimum. I cut slots into the redwood frame to hold the 1/4 inch plywood. The frame was held together with screws and standard yellow wood glue, and then clamped until the glue was dry. I made part of the bottom out of reclaimed boards I found in my shed, and then I cut excess 1/4 inch plywood to fit the space and glued it into the existing frame. I drilled holes into the side of the enclosure that will be positioned just above the substrate. These will enable cross ventilation and a chimney effect as air heated by the lights rises out of the screen top and fresh air is pulled in from the sides of the vents. These holes were covered with pre-made screen vents to ensure that there would be no escapes of geckos or any prey insects that I feed to the geckos. Once completed, the enclosure was waterproofed with Pond Shield epoxy, which was a bit annoying to apply but worked well and is held up to my water checks. The outside of the enclosure was finished with polyurethane. The door tracks were ordered from Amazon. They're just 1/8 inch tracks to accommodate 1/8 inch glass doors. I chose 1/8 inch because that is the size of the glass that is used to make 10-gallon aquariums, and the glass doors themselves I salvaged from an old 10-gallon aquarium. I also used the rims from this same 10-gallon aquarium to ensure that the glass doors were flush with the sides of the enclosure to prevent gecko escapes. These were attached with superglue and 100% silicone, which is aquarium safe. The screen top was made with a standard window screen kit and fiberglass window screen. And that's the gist of the construction process. If you'd like a more detailed tutorial on my next build, please let me know in the comments. This design is somewhat unique, and I'd be happy to discuss it more if there's sufficient interest. In the meantime, I will also include some links in the description below to existing tutorials by more experienced vivarium builders if you're looking to get started right now. In terms of the actual landscape of the enclosure, for the false bottom I used plastic egg crate to maximize the volume of my wastewater basin and minimize weight when the enclosure is drained of water. I will link to a tutorial on how to make a false bottom if you need further instruction. I did remove a section of egg crate to insert a hidden section of PVC pipe, which will give me access to the wastewater basin if I need to drain the enclosure. This will mostly be buried and will not be for regular use, as I'm not anticipating this enclosure will need frequent manual drainage. For the portion of the enclosure actually inhabited by my geckos, I wanted a background with lots of surfaces for climbing, and that plants could easily root into to provide cover and additional climbing surfaces for the geckos. As we discussed earlier, a mourning gecko colony needs lots of cover so each gecko can find her own hiding space. I also wanted the background to be modular and thus removable if eventually I want to repurpose or repair this enclosure. As such, I used styrofoam panels as a base for my backdrop so that they could be inserted into place. I cut the panels to size and coated them in a layer of Drylock to waterproof them and give them some substance and prevent flaking. I then tinted Drylock with black and brown acrylic paint and pressed cocoa chips and cocoa fiber into the wet paint. This doesn't look perfect, but that's okay, this is just the base. As much of this will be foamed over, this was probably overkill to begin with, but I just wanted to be sure that it looked good in the end. Next, I collected the bark of a fallen cork oak tree and I sterilized it in my oven. I laid out the pieces into a pattern that looked fairly natural, and I held them in place with expanding pond foam. I unfortunately ran out of my black expanding pond foam, so I had to finish the process with regular gaps and cracks. That's not a problem, but it's just a little bit more challenging to cover up and make look natural at the end. I let the foam cure, and then I cut it away with a knife to shape it and expose the inner porous surface. I then mixed acrylic paint into more Drylock, and I painted over any foam sections that were completed with the lighter colored spray foam. Next, it was time to complete the surface of the backdrop. Using 100% silicone, I used GE Silicone 1. I put a layer of silicone over all exposed foam, and I pressed orchid bark and cocoa fiber into the silicone. This was repeated with all 3 panels. Once completed, I siliconed all 3 panels into place as the vivarium backdrop. Next, I used apple branches that I'd collected this past autumn as additional hardscape and climbing branches for my geckos. I fixed these branches in place with expanding pond foam and allowed the foam to cure. Once cured, I carved out the foam and coated it with silicone, orchid bark, and cocoa fiber as discussed previously. With the backdrop and branches in place, I inserted my false bottom and I was ready to attach my doors in the vivarium top. I also cut out sections of acrylic that I've left over from a previous project to partially cover the screen top of the vivarium. This will just increase overall humidity in the enclosure. And there you have it, the completed vivarium. Planting and introducing my geckos will be covered in the next video. I was hoping to combine all of it into a single video, but the length is getting pretty long, and if I'm being totally honest, I'm not very good at video editing, and I'm out of space on my computer. So this is what my computer will allow me to edit right now, and I am currently planting it. Part 2 will be to follow. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and leave me a comment. Thank you so much for watching, and take care.